Brussels Bytes, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi friends, and welcome back. For today's episode, I want to take us in a different direction and focus on European climate and energy policies. They're not only important for our decarbonization efforts and fighting climate change, but directly tied with European economic prosperity, as well as powering our digital infrastructure. The European Commission likes to say that the green and digital transition go hand in hand, even though sometimes they appear to be at odds with each other. In short, today we'll be asking, are we doing climate and energy policy wrong in the EU? Our guest today, Line Andersen, is an economist at the Center for Political Studies, CEPOS, in Denmark. As a researcher, her areas of interest are climate and energy economics, productivity, and regulation. Line, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. The European Commission is going through a much-needed simplification effort when it comes to certain provisions of our climate and sustainability framework. There's been a lot of talk about this in the last couple of months in Brussels. It has become a point of contention for different circles and policymakers. What do you make of these efforts about simplification? Is this going in the good direction or something more needs to be done?
Yeah, as you said, it is definitely a much needed simplification effort, but I actually don't think it's enough. Even though it is a step in the right direction, there is definitely more to do. So, if we take the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, one of the simplification efforts is that they have postponed it and they have agreed on fewer companies being a part of this regulation. And yeah, this will bring fewer costs with the regulation. But if we take a step back and discuss what is even the point of this regulation, what is the purpose of it? And the purpose of these reporting requirements is that they want to enable stakeholders to evaluate sustainability performance. And yeah, I guess that sounds nice. Um, but if we look at it from a cost benefit perspective, what are the costs associated to this regulation? Um, in Denmark, we have estimated that the cost of this regulation before they amended it, it would be around 1 billion euros per year for administrative burdens for companies. That is a lot, and it is definitely most likely an understatement because this doesn't account for the fact that much of the smaller companies, which the regulation did not apply to, would also
Mhm.
have to deliver reporting to the larger businesses. So, okay, so we know what the costs are, we know what the purpose of the regulation is. Then the burden of proof would be on the commission to actually prove that this reporting requirements delivers benefits to society outweighing these costs. I don't believe the commission has done that. And I don't believe that these reporting requirements actually improve sustainability in the EU. We have, and we will discuss this in much greater detail, but with the emission trading systems, we have what the most effective and the most cost effective measure in the climate policy area. And every time you try and impose more regulation as the CSRD, you merely increase the cost of the green transition without really improving it. So there are a lot of costs associated with this CSRD regulation, and those are definitely at the business side that companies will have a large administrative burden with these reporting requirements, and the benefits would be presumably that would improve sustainability performance. But the burden of proof should lie at the commission, and I don't believe the commission has lifted this burden of proof and actually made sure that this will improve sustainability performance. So the benefits are very unclear, especially when you take into account the emissions trading systems, which are in the EU a very effective and the cheapest way of achieving the green transition. So every time we impose further regulation as the CSRD, and we have an effective ETS, that actually just means that we increase the cost of the green transition without actually improving sustainability and the climate change policies.
Yeah, we'll return to the ETS in a bit, but I just want to pick up on this argument you make. I think this is a key detail in this discussion. It's whether, first of all, these policies are cost effective, and secondly, are they actually helping us achieve the goal of fighting climate change? Because I think right now, on the surface of it looks as if it's a good policy, reporting obligations, how you're actually achieving sustainability, value chains, and so forth. But when you dig deeper, it turns out that the discussion gets way more complex, and we're not actually achieving our goals. And here, Lynn, I want to stay a bit longer on the broader philosophy behind the European Green Deal and take the conversation a bit further. Because you and I and the majority of people agree on the need for collective action on climate change. The scientific community is absolutely clear that there's so many man-made negative impacts on our environment. We're not debating this. But are we sometimes over-exaggerating the involved damage and negative effects? How can we have a more sensible discussion on this, not just a fear-driven discussion? And here I pick up on your research about climate economics, where you make the case about the priority of having cost-effective climate policy. And I think in Brussels, we did not have such cost-effective policies. Can you tell us more about this line of thought?
Definitely. So the main point about this line of thought is definitely to think about trade-offs. So every time we make a political decision or we talk about climate change, there is definitely a trade-off. So I like to think of it in extremes in order to understand what are these trade-offs associated with climate change and climate change mitigation. So on one extreme, that would be that we stop all emissions tomorrow, and that would obviously be have catastrophic consequences. It would mean that people would suffer from very high temperatures because they couldn't cool down, or very low temperatures they couldn't heat up. If food security, all kinds of problems if we stopped emitting CO2 altogether at once. Huge costs. But we also have the other extreme, and that would be to increase our emissions significantly and just go nuts and just emit a lot of CO2. That would also be an extreme scenario. That's not where we are headed. We are not perfect, but we are not increasing crazy. And that would, if we did that, that would mean we would have an even higher risk of increasing temperatures that would lead to climate damages, which would also have huge impacts on people and their lives. And I think and hope most people don't find any of these extremes um, very good. And I hope that most people agree, all right, we might be somewhere in between these two extremes. But the big question is, how do we assess? How do we see where's the balance? Where's the balance of these extremes? And that's where climate economics come in, because those are focused on that. On one hand, we have costs that are climate damages from increasing temperatures, which we are very much focused on in the public debate. And on the other hand, we also have the mitigation costs and also the impact that mitigating will have. So there are two costs to this, and they should be balanced. And that can be balanced by imposing a cost benefit approach. Also, as we just discussed before with the CSRD, also here we need the cost benefit approach to actually determine what is a reasonable middle way. So the climate economic literature, it's extremely uncertain. I must say that beforehand, but this is uh, some of our best guesses. So we don't know everything. We have no possible way of knowing everything because we're looking way into the future. All parameters of this research is uncertain, the economic parameters and also the climate parameters. So it is a best guess. But according to our best guesses, the cost benefit optimal temperature increase, or the temperature target, is between 1.9 and 2.6 Celsius degrees, which is remarkably, it is higher than the lower part of the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, but closer to to the 2-degree target, and also actually close to the way we are headed with the already agreed on and implemented policies in the world. So this would imply that we should put a cost on emitting carbon, and the cost of this carbon emissions should be between 60 or 150 euros today. And just to put it into perspective, in the EU, we have put a price on almost all carbon emission. And in the ETS1, the old ETS, the optimal price, the price is close to 70 euros today. And with the new ETS system, it would be close to 25 euros. So we are not quite there in the optimal part, but we're close actually in the EU.
We're close in the EU. The cost benefit thing is very interesting, and it kind of also resonates with a number of policy recommendations and appeals we've had in the Martin Center and discussions we had with the broader center-right political family here, and mainly the point about any future legislation coming from the Commission when it comes to climate and sustainability needs to have a rigorous financial impact assessment. There needs to be an expectation of the involved costs, because we've done a series of research deep dives in the last couple of years. And maybe you remember, Line, there was this appeal that the Green Deal is going to mobilize 1 trillion euros of investment from public and private funding. But throughout the last couple of years, we've been bombarded with all of these increased estimates about these policies. There's always discussion about the climate gap. We're missing 200, 300, 400 billion euros per year on climate spending. And the climate bill just kept on rising. And in the end of the day, we reach exactly this point of debate. First of all, are these policies justified? And secondly, do they actually make sense for the European taxpayer? But I also want to involve a piece of research you recently published together with Epicenter, a think tank we also collaborate with. You were among the authors, where you talk about a market approach to clean and abundant energy. Walk us through some of your highlights, because I see how in your research, in your thinking, there's a clear attempt to have a more market perspective when it comes to climate policies.
Yeah, definitely. So the climate change problem is something that the market cannot handle on its own, but we can solve the problem, or we can mitigate the problem by using the market mechanisms. And that's where the EU comes in. So EU is the largest actor on that we can actually use. So instead of each member state doing their climate policies, it's much better for the European Commission or the EU to actually do the climate policies, because it's a global problem that requires global solutions. And the EU is actually a very key player in this area and have the potential to actually impose a cost-effective green transition. But that would require a number of reforms. We have the foundation put down with the emission trading system, and it is being extended with the ETS2 here in 2027, according to plan. And that is very, very positive. So we have this framework which can act as a market approach to mitigate climate change in the most cost-effective way. However, the climate regulation in the EU is not perfect. It has the potential, but there are needed some reforms. For example, right now we will have 2 different ETS systems, ETS1 and ETS2. This implies, as I said before, you would have 2 different prices on emissions depending on which ETS you're covered by. And when you have different prices on emissions, this implies that you could have gotten some cheaper emissions other places than you get when you have this sector division. So when you're in one sector pays a maximum of 25 euros per ton CO2, and in the other you pay 70 euros per ton CO2, that implies that you could have had emissions reductions for 50 euro in the cheap sector, which you won't realize because you have these different prices. You have this lower price. So it's ineffective to have 2 different quota systems. It would be much more effective to have all emissions within one emission trading system. So that's one part of a needed reform of the EU climate policy. But a more important part of a reform would be to look into the regulation outside of the ETS. So we talked about before the CSRD, that's a sustainability performance regulation, and we have the EU has banned the sale of new internal combustion engine cars from
Hmm.
2035. We have renewable energy share targets in the EU, so we want to increase the share of renewables in our energy system. And all of this sounds like, well, it's something that's good for the climate, right? Uh, but we forget the fact that we have to look into the cost benefits of it and how does it interact with the ETS. We have the ETS, which is a great system, market-based approach, which ensures that we get the cheapest emissions. But in an effective ETS, you will also get leakage as soon as you impose more regulation. So all of this regulation imposed outside of the ETS will merely lead to leakage, which in effective ETS would mean no more. You won't get more emission reductions. It will only increase the cost.
It will increase the cost. And here I want to do a quick follow up on the ETS. I hear the message you give for the reform of the ETS, but right now we're in the timeline you mentioned about expanding it in 27. What would you say to the arguments brought forward that expanding the ETS on buildings and road transport, which is the plan for 27, do you think this would bring for European consumers indirect taxation and increased costs? Because these are certain fears right now which are circulating here in Brussels.
Yeah, so the point of the ETS is first and foremost and to increase the cost of emitting carbon.
Mhm.
So that is it. That is the plan, and I hope it actually works because it's the point of it. But I think there is an important nuance to this, and that is that in each member state, I don't know the regulation in all the member states, but I do know in Denmark we have fuel taxes, and these fuels will also be covered by the ETS too, which means that we will have double taxations on the same emissions. And when
Mhm.
we have the ETS2, we will again have this leakage issue. So Danish fuel taxes will impose costs to consumers, but won't decrease the emissions in the EU. So yeah, there is definitely something to be very aware of here, because it might actually just come with an increased costs, which doesn't help the climate.
Yeah, that's key. Increasing the price or indirect taxation for consumers in the hope that this mitigates or prevents climate change, but actually we're not even addressing the main issue. Um, let's focus a bit on energy per se. You mentioned the need for clean and abundant energy in your report, and I think the second part about abundance here is often forgotten. And in the Martin Center and part of my work, we always want to bring forward the argument about energy security and the overall availability of energy in Europe, given the fact that, as we all know, we're paying twice or triple the price of energy, gas, and electricity compared, let's say, to the US or China. And knowing how important electricity price is for development of infrastructure, industry, even data centers, it's always striking when I remember that around 20% of the electricity in Ireland is used to power data centers. And I think in the next couple of years here in Europe, we'll need more and more electricity to cover our expanding digital infrastructure. So tell us a bit more about your concept of clean and abundant energy. Do we have a problem with abundance here in Europe?
Yeah, so I think we definitely are looking into problems with energy security, following the fact that we are increasing our transition to renewable energies. And that's simply due to the fact that when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't uh, blow,
Hmm.
uh, we won't have energy. And if all the member states rely on importing themselves to energy security, we'll have a problem. And that is a political problem, that the politicians insist that we want only renewables and they want to plan how the energy system should be. And I think something we should be very aware of, and that we also in Denmark also is preparing for already, is the fact that we'll look into more price fluctuations. We'll look into having more power outages due to the fact that we are building our energy system around renewable energies. Not saying that renewable energies is a bad thing, but they will challenge the energy security. And that's why the EU needs a more robust electricity market. And the politicians in each member state does have an obligation to actually make sure that we get a more robust energy system and not rely on importing us to energy security. And I think one example of this, a member state trying to rely on other countries, is the decision in Germany to phase out nuclear power plants because that weakens the resilience in the entire EU. And this is a political decision. This is not technological neutral. This is a
Mm.
way of actually dampening the resilience in the European systems. So that's one thing the member states need to actually focus on, not hampering the energy market, but also removing all price regulations in the energy market, because different member states have some price regulations where they can put caps on prices on electricity, and that sounds sympathetic. It sounds like this is something to protect vulnerable consumers. I think that's the wording they use, and yeah, that sounds good. But the problem is when you put a cap on pricing and you have some electricity which the prices are fluctuating heavily, that means that at some points the price could increase very, very much because there is not very much energy to take from. So
Mhm.
if we put a cap on the price, then that could just lead to power outages. And more importantly, it will decrease the incentives to invest in capacity. And we do need capacity for these periods of no wind or no solar. So these price regulations are a very, very difficult thing that should be abandoned by the EU, or at least they should make the member states abandon them.
You make a very valid point here, not only about the intermittency, which we all know, but about the reliability of the whole system when it's mainly powered by renewables. And I think even though this issue became politicized as well, but I mean, we saw the best example a couple of weeks ago in Spain and in Portugal, a system which is primarily at this point of time was primarily dependent on renewable energy, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but it turns out that the system was unstable. There was not sufficient backup, which also brings us to the question about batteries, about storage, also investing in grids. And long story short, rolling out renewables just for the sake of rolling out renewables doesn't make sense unless you have all the enabling technology, unless you've invested in your grids, and you need to have sufficient time for the rollout of this. And here in the EU, we're faced with these extremely tight timelines for expanding our renewables and for chasing clean energy, when we see that this process takes a long time because you need to reset and rethink your whole power networks. So it's a very long process. But maybe as a final point, and to end on a more optimistic note, and we start talking about renewables, in our podcast we usually talk about technologies, breakthrough innovation. When we talk about decarbonization here, Line, according to you, which are the most important innovations or technologies in which we should invest more when it comes to having more clean and abundant energy in Europe?
So I think that's a great question, but I have to maybe disappoint and just point out that I'm not an expert in picking winners among climate tech because I'm not an investor. This is
Technology
not my
neutrality,
kind of
right?
business.
Technology neutrality, right?
Yeah, exactly. Neutrality. So the point I want to make regarding this, what should we invest in? I think the most important thing is that the politicians don't try and pick the winners because they most likely will fail, and that will just make it more expensive for everyone. So the politicians should mainly focus on providing technology neutral frameworks that will allow innovation, and then the market will make sure that there will be invested in the technologies that will be the the best technologies for the future.
By the way, the European Parliament, for example, was very positively biased in the last mandate about hydrogen and clean hydrogen. There was a huge push coming from politicians. And then you sit down, and I've had private conversations with some of them, and then you see that it's mostly ambition, it's mostly a talking point. It sounds nice, but when you look at the final investment decisions when it comes to hydrogen, when you look at the enabling infrastructure, when you look at the actual investment involved, it turns out that hydrogen is boutique, niche, and something which maybe will be developed in the 2030s. But just a European institution putting its weight behind a certain type of technology doesn't mean that this will materialize in the future. And I think here you drive a really, really important point forward. Don't put your political weight behind certain technologies, but make sure you have the enabling framework. Line, this has been a great conversation. Thank you much for joining us. Line Andersen from Danish think tank CEPOS. Dear friends, join us next time in Brussels Bytes.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bytes. Follow us on SoundCloud for more.